And before our first morning break, our last presentation will be International Harmonization and Integration.
I can do it. Thank you. Good morning, everybody. Thanks for having myself and my team that I'm here representing. It's an honor to be here. I agree with our previous speakers that the feeling of community and the sense to accomplish something in the room is something that we're happy to be a part of and look forward to contributing to. Personally, me and our colleagues from the Department of Engineering Education at Ohio State are new to this kind of venue within aviation and the FAA, but we look forward to bringing our skill sets to contribute well to the room. And I personally am going to do so through Project 18, International Harmonization and Integration. I myself am David Delane, and from Ohio State, we have several colleagues who are working closely with us. Greg Bixler, who is also from the Department of Engineering Education. We have Sean Prusnicki, who's here in the room from Industrial Engineering at Ohio State. Brian Stremskowski, who is from the Center of Aviation at Ohio State University as well, and Seth Young, of course. The other side of our team is from Drexel University, led by the PI there, Adam Fontecchio and Ellen Bass. Our team is structured well in the way where from the Ohio State team, we're split evenly between engineering education expertise and various types of aviation expertise. And then from the Drexel side as well, we have expertise in technical education by Adam Fontecchio, and then human factors and automation by Ellen Bass. Our project title, Global Alignment Within Aviation Education Using a Boundary Spanning Framework, is a process designed, we will set forth, and as we've started already, to use a strategic approach to build international collaboration and partnerships within the field. So how will we do that? We are, like I mentioned, a systematic approach to establish a global network of aviation educators to facilitate international collaboration and harmony within the field. I mentioned boundary spanning, and this is an organizational dynamics term, which is a systematic approach to building partnerships around mutual benefits. So what we will be doing here is first identifying the key stakeholders in the field. Second, determining what types of practices are going around everywhere, going around internationally, which practices run parallel, which practices are complementary to what the FAA is doing. Then, as the project progresses, we will be recommending pathways for international collaboration and identifying global best practices to see how the FAA can move forward informed by what's happening internationally. First, I will discuss our outcomes, and then we will look into each task more closely so that we can all understand what we're trying to accomplish here. Our first outcome is mostly will be informed by internet search. Of understanding who are the players internationally around the globe within aviation navigation. This includes, but it's not limited to, professional societies, institutions, which would include academic institutions, public institutions, as well as private institutions, educational bodies, whether they are strictly a body that does technical training or development, or whether they are tied to some type of degree-granting institution, and individuals who are working strongly within the field to prepare air traffic controllers. Our second outcome would be once the main players are identified globally, looking to establish interviews with key stakeholders or groups identified through the first outcome. We will be developing a interview protocol using literature from the boundary spanning community as well as international comparative education to create a research-informed protocol that will allow us to develop the processes, methods, and structures that are used to train these individuals. With that protocol in place, we will seek out partners from around the world from a variety of the institutions that we mentioned, to try to see what we can learn from them and what type of information will emerge through these interviews that can help inform the practices of the FAA, as well as inform the development of collaborative opportunities, mutual exchanges, and partnerships. And then lastly, as we wrap up this first year, recommendations for global best practices, as I mentioned, for international exchange and partnership. So let's take a closer look at the first task. In this case here, we will be mapping existing programs and identifying key stakeholders. And so this will mostly take place through an online review of the educational stakeholders. I think it's been wonderful to be a part of this meeting so far because we can already see the amount of information that is going to emerge. And so we will take a structured approach and probably reviewing a lot of the outcomes that the rest of our team here is generating to find out what type of information we're going to go after, exactly is our scope, and how we can determine who are the players in this field. So primarily through online search, we will begin to develop a global landscape of who are the players in this field, collecting information on who these people are, what are the resources, modules, and toolkits they're using, and collecting all these data for a qualitative document review once we have obtained our information. Last part of this phase would be a synthesis and mapping of the data that's been collected to kind of begin to understand the global landscape within aviation navigation education. Our second task would be identification and interviewing of key stakeholders. As I mentioned, we will be leveraging the outcomes from task 1 to identify who these stakeholders are, as well as the networks of all of the individuals in the room and within the industry. This is one area where perhaps we could use your help. I know that collectively in the room, an extensive network, both domestically and internationally, exists within our efforts. Any names, resources, and individuals of people who you feel are leaders in the field or who have some connection to international efforts, if you could bring them to myself, I'll be around through the rest of the afternoon. It would be wonderful as we're beginning to build a database of who these players are so that we can start to reach out and begin scheduling and lining up our interviews. One thing that we are concerned about that you may be able to help us get around is access. If we are going into asking particular questions about training, structures, and methodologies, some of it may be proprietary, some of it may be not, individuals may not be willing to share. In that case, handshakes and introductions from our colleagues in the room would be very helpful to allow us that access and kind of grant us that information. Like I mentioned, we will be developing a research-informed protocol that will allow us to, in a structured way, extract the relevant information for this effort. And then the last part, of course, perform the interviews, which will be, following all educational research protocols for confidentiality, for, qualitative analysis, and making sure that the data is handled appropriately. Our last phase is kind of the processing of all the data that has come out of the first tasks, where analysis of the interviews and mapping efforts through mixed methods will be used to see what is the information that's emerging. This work is fairly exploratory, so at this phase it'll be a lot of collecting information and seeing what emerges. Through a qualitative process, if we were going to say we're looking for this particular one outcome, that may blind us to the rest of the opportunities that are out there. So we are approaching this from an exploratory kind of direction to see what are the opportunities for parallel and complementary practices internationally. And then lastly, we will be developing a set of recommendations that can lead to concrete and impactful actions that can be taken in the future so that the FAA can march forward more closely in step with our international peers, establish pathways for the continual exchange of information and best practices, and continue to make sure that we're accomplishing all of our goals collectively with our international peers. Our milestones I didn't get too into detail here, but basically we'll have the mapping and documentation of existing structures and stakeholders over the first 4 months, over which the next 9 months we will develop, schedule, and perform the interviews with our stakeholders, and then over the last 3 months or so, perform the qualitative analysis and synthesis of all the data that has emerged. Here is some info on our budget, equally split across the 2 universities. And thank you. So like I mentioned, what would be helpful for us is if you have any wonderful contacts internationally who you believe are doing excellent work, we would be happy to hear from them. Another thing that we are trying to consider within our approach is that it would be short-sighted to only look at the leading edge and assume that we would only be able to learn from the leading edge within this field. We will take a global, diverse approach, not only looking at the best, but looking at who is doing excellent work with limited resources and what can we learn from them. So where, there are some industry leaders, NAV Canada, Australia, et cetera, but who are those other players that, may come out of left field and are doing excellent work? So we are looking to cast a wide net across the globe to see exactly what we can extract. And yes, it is a systematic approach, but also will be left open-ended so that we can get at those interesting emergent outcomes that can help us all progress forward. Any questions? Wonderful, thank you.